The St. Joseph Auto Repair Shop breathed the smell of oil and honest work. On that hot March morning, amidst the rhythmic sound of tools, little Michael, 10 years old, lived in his own private universe. While other kids lost themselves in video games, he found himself in the details of an engine, in the logic of a screw, in the symphony of a well-tuned car. His father, Joe Roberts, a dedicated mechanic, saw the curiosity in his son but didn't grasp its true depth. He saw a boy fascinated by his work, not realizing that within that small body resided a brilliant mind, a sponge silently absorbing every secret of automotive engineering, holding a knowledge no one could imagine. The peace of the workshop was shattered by the roar of a V8 engine. A red Ferrari, gleaming like a jewel, slid into the garage, an object from another world in that environment of grease and sweat. From it stepped Margaret Silver, a woman whose presence seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Dressed in designer clothes and adorned with diamonds, she was the personification of wealth and impatience. Her high heels echoed on the concrete, and her voice was a command. "I need this fixed. Today," she said without a greeting, pointing to the car. "I have an important event tomorrow, and this Ferrari needs to be perfect." She wasn't a customer. She was a force of nature, a storm of arrogance about to break. Fascinated, Michael slowly approached the red machine, drawn like a moth to a flame. His childish eyes traced the perfect lines, the brilliant paint. In a gesture of pure and innocent admiration, he reached out his hand and gently touched the hood, wanting to feel the vibration of that work of art. That was the trigger. "What is that child doing touching my car?" Margaret's scream exploded, paralyzing the entire workshop. "Get that filthy child away from here now!" The boy recoiled, startled, his eyes filling with tears. Joe Roberts ran to his son, his face burning with shame, as the public, cruel and disproportionate humiliation rained down on them like a steel net. A boy's innocent curiosity was met with a scream of fury and humiliation. But what this arrogant woman doesn't know is that she's about to be challenged by the most unexpected talent of all. If you believe that genius has no age or social class, subscribe to the channel and like this video. Joe Roberts' helplessness in the face of Margaret's fury didn't come from cowardice, but from a protective love. 3 years earlier, he had lost his wife to a sudden illness, becoming both father and mother to little Michael. Every day was a silent battle to keep their home, pay the bills, and above all, ensure his son had a future. The job at Tony's workshop wasn't just a job. It was the only wall separating them from poverty. Swallowing the humiliation, silencing his own anger, was a sacrifice he made to protect the most precious thing in his life. He would rather feel the sting of shame than risk the livelihood that put food on his son's table. His submission in that moment was the harshest and most painful expression of his fatherly love. While Joe Roberts saw a future to be secured, Michael saw a world to be deciphered. His mind was not that of an ordinary child. Where others saw a jumble of parts, he saw complex systems, an almost musical logic. He had a photographic memory for diagrams and a hearing so acute he could distinguish the misfire of a single piston in an engine's sound. He read old technical manuals found in the workshop with the same eagerness other children read comic books, absorbing and cataloging every piece of information in a vast and organized mental archive. His father considered him a smart kid, but had no idea of the phenomenon he was raising. Michael was a self-taught genius, flourishing in secret in the fertile soil of grease and steel. The workshop was Michael's sanctuary, a playground of logic and creation where he felt safe and understood. There, the noise of the tools was music, and the smell of oil, the scent of home. It was the place where he connected with his father and with his own essence. The arrival of Margaret and her Ferrari was the brutal invasion of the outside world, a world that didn't value knowledge, but only the status that money could buy. The humiliation she imposed on them wasn't just a personal attack. It was a desecration of his refuge, an act of contempt against his father's honest work and the pure passion he built for machines. The collision between these two worlds was inevitable. Margaret's threat hung over the workshop like a storm cloud, poisoning the air with fear. Tony, the owner, felt trapped between the duty to protect his employee and the dread of facing a rich and vengeful client. In a tense negotiation, Joe Roberts managed a fragile agreement. Michael wouldn't be expelled, but exiled. The boy was taken to a dusty corner at the back of the garage, with strict orders not to approach, not to touch anything, to effectively become invisible. From his small prison, he watched his father and the other mechanics approach the Ferrari, not with their usual confidence, but with the caution of men disarming a bomb. The job had become a dangerous performance. The Ferrari's engine was a high-tech labyrinth, and the problem, a ghost that refused to manifest. The mechanics, experienced and competent men, began their diagnostics, but were met with a frustrating mystery. The car ran, but imperfectly. There was a subtle power loss and a nearly inaudible noise that no device could identify. The computers showed no clear error codes, only minor anomalies that led nowhere. They tested the ignition system, the fuel line, the sensors. Every attempt was a dead end, and every passing hour increased the feeling that they were fighting something that logic couldn't explain. Margaret's impatience became a form of torture. Every half hour, she would approach, the clicking of her heels, marking the rhythm of her growing irritation. "Well, have you found it yet?" she'd ask, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Remember, I need the car today." Her acidic comments and intimidating presence created an atmosphere of unbearable pressure, turning the technical challenge into a psychological hell. The mechanics, sweating, felt the weight of every second, knowing that any mistake would be used against them. The workshop, once a place of teamwork, had become a courtroom where they were judged with every trial and error. From his exile in the back of the workshop, Michael watched everything, but he saw much more. While the adults saw an unsolvable problem, his brilliant childlike mind saw a pattern. He heard the sound that the others couldn't decipher, connected the symptoms that seemed random to them. He saw the unnecessary replacement of the fuel pump and understood why the electronic tests yielded nothing. In his mind, the puzzle was already solved. An immense desire to run to his father and tell him the solution burned in his chest, but the memory of the humiliation and the promise he had made kept him chained to his corner. He held the key, but they had locked him outside the door. From his small, glass-walled office, Tony, the workshop's owner, watched the scene with a heavy heart. He, who had built this business with 40 years of sweat and honesty, felt like a tightrope walker. On one side, Margaret's fury, a powerful client whose wrath could tarnish a lifetime's reputation. On the other, the wounded dignity of Joe Roberts, his best employee, a good man and a single father, and the shrinking figure of little Michael, exiled in his own refuge. Tony saw, with the clarity of his 60 years of experience, a microcosm of the world. The arrogance of money trying to crush the simplicity of labor, and him, in the middle, trying to keep it all from falling apart. The truth is, deep down, Tony always knew Michael was different. He had seen the boy grow, up among the engines, and the memories came in flashes. Michael, at 5, pointing out a loose belt that no one else had noticed. At 7, explaining to a customer the difference between direct and indirect injection with a simplicity that bordered on genius. He had always treated these moments as the eccentricity of a smart kid, but now, seeing his best men defeated by a stubborn engine, the memory of the unshakable confidence in Michael's eyes when he spoke of the problem began to echo in his mind. What if it wasn't just cleverness? What if it was something more, a raw, pure and extraordinary talent? As the tension in the workshop reached an unbearable point, with Margaret about to explode and his mechanics on the verge of exhaustion, Tony made a decision. It was a gamble, perhaps the biggest of his professional life. He could follow protocol, admit defeat, apologize to the client, and bear the consequences. Or he could do something radical. He could bet on the intuition of a 10-year-old boy against the logic of all the experienced adults. He looked at Michael, quiet in his corner, and saw not a child, but a possibility. In that moment, the old, wise workshop owner decided that sometimes the most unlikely solution is the only one left. He would bet on the hidden genius, not the visible arrogance. After 4 hours of failed attempts, defeat hung over the mechanics. "We don't know what it is, Tony," Joe Roberts admitted, his voice heavy. Margaret, with a victorious and cruel smile, threw the keys on the counter. "Enough! I'm tired of this incompetence. You can expect to hear from my lawyers." At the exact moment she was turning to leave, a small, clear voice cut through the dense air of the workshop. "Dad, I know what the problem is." Everyone froze. It was Michael, who had left his corner. Joe tried to silence him, panic on his face, but the seed of curiosity had already been planted in Tony's heart, who saw in that interruption one last, desperate roll of the dice. Before Margaret could explode again, Tony stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. In a gesture that shocked everyone, he ignored the furious client and his defeated employees and walked over to the boy. He knelt to be at Michael's level, conferring upon the child an authority no one else there possessed. "Michael," he said, his voice calm and serious, "what did you see that we, the adults, couldn't?" Margaret's laugh echoed, incredulous. "Now the owner is going to ask a child for advice. What a circus!" But Tony paid her no attention. His eyes remained fixed on Michael, a silent bet on the potential he had always suspected was there. Empowered by Tony's trust, Michael spoke, and his voice was not that of a child, but of an expert. "The problem isn't in the parts," he said. "It's in the air. The engine isn't broken, it's suffocating." The analogy was simple and brilliant. "There's a secondary air filter, a very small and hidden one. Nobody ever checks it. And think it's clogged, not with dust, but with something sticky that got in there." The mechanics stared at each other, stunned. They knew of the part, an obscure and rarely problematic component, but they had never thought to check it. How could this boy, who barely reached the height of the engine, know of its existence? "And how do you know that, kid? Did you guess?" Margaret asked, the sarcasm in her voice now tinged with a hint of curiosity. Michael's answer was a stroke of logic and memory. "I remember my dad talking about these filters once, and the sound of the engine is just like the sound of Mr. Ferdinand's car, which had the same problem." Joe looked at him, the memory of that distant conversation surfacing, admiration overcoming his fear. Michael's theory wasn't a guess. It was a deduction based on keen observation and an extraordinary memory. The seed of doubt had been planted in everyone's mind. "Carl," Tony ordered, "check the secondary filter, now." A 10-year-old boy's theory could be the key to the mystery no adult could solve. Could he be right? If you've ever felt the thrill of seeing intuition challenge logic, share your story in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the incredible revelation. Following the child's instructions, the mechanic Carl removed the parts covering the indicated area. Everyone in the workshop leaned in, holding their breath. Margaret, still with her arms crossed, watched with an intensity that mixed skepticism with a curiosity she could no longer hide. After a few minutes of tense silence, Carl finally extracted the small filter. He held it up for everyone to see, and a collective gasp of astonishment filled the room. The filter was completely obstructed by a dark, sticky substance like a resin. It wasn't dust, it wasn't common dirt. It was the unlikely and bizarre cause of the problem, exactly as the boy had predicted. The impossible had just become real. While the mechanic stared at the part, stunned, Michael smiled for the first time that day, a smile of pure and innocent satisfaction. "I knew it by the sound," he said, explaining his logic with a brilliant simplicity. "It's like when we have a cold and can't breathe right through our nose. Our voice sounds different. The engine had a stuffy nose. That's why its rumble wasn't normal." The analogy was brilliant, disarming the complexity of engineering with the purity of childish intuition. He hadn't used machines. He had used empathy. He treated the car not as an object, but as a body that was complaining, and he was the only one who knew how to listen to its language. The revelation was an earthquake for Margaret. "It's not possible," she whispered, her voice devoid of all arrogance. She looked at Michael, and for the first time, she didn't see the mechanic's son, the dirty child. She saw a pure talent, an intelligence she couldn't buy, that she couldn't intimidate. All her wealth, all her status, suddenly seemed empty and meaningless in the face of the boy's genius. On that workshop floor, dirty with grease, Margaret, the queen of a business empire, was confronted with an emotion she hadn't felt in decades: humility. The wall of her arrogance had been demolished by the wisdom of a 10-year-old child. Unaware of the internal revolution he had caused in Margaret, Michael continued, his passion for his craft overflowing. "Would you like me to explain how the electronic fuel injection system, or the engine cooling, works?" he offered, with the enthusiasm of someone sharing his treasure. The offer, so genuine and so brilliant, broke the woman's last barrier of resistance. What should have been an insult coming from a child sounded like an invitation to a fascinating world. The powerful businesswoman became, in that instant, a student. "Please, Michael," she said, her voice now soft and respectful, as she pulled up a chair to sit. "Explain it to me." The role reversal was complete, shocking, and somehow redemptive. The workshop transformed into an unlikely classroom. The wealthy woman in her expensive clothes sat on a metal stool, completely fascinated, while the 10-year-old boy, with his hands still dirty with grease, explained the secrets of a V8 engine. Michael spoke with a contagious passion, using simple analogies to translate complex engineering concepts. The mechanics, including his father, gathered around, listening in reverent silence, learning from the child things that years of experience had not taught them. The hierarchy of status and age had dissolved. There was only one master and his many students, and the master was the smallest of them all. "Where did you learn all this?" Margaret asked, genuine curiosity completely replacing her former arrogance. Michael's answer was a portrait of his reality, here in the workshop, in the old magazines, and at the public library. The simplicity of the answer exposed a painful paradox: a world-class mind being nourished with scraps of information. Joe Roberts, with a mixture of pride and sadness, completed the picture, explaining the limitations of the neighborhood's public school, a place that had no resources to challenge a mind like his son's. Moved by a new emotion, Margaret leaned in and asked Michael about his biggest dream. The boy's eyes lit up with a light that illuminated the entire workshop. "I want to be an automotive engineer, Aunt Margaret," he said, the aunt coming out with an affectionate naturalness. "I want to design cars that don't pollute, invent batteries that last longer. I have so many ideas in my head." His dream wasn't about owning a Ferrari, but about reinventing it. The pure, visionary ambition of that child, born amidst so many difficulties, was what finally demolished the last defenses of Margaret's hardened heart. She saw in him not just a genius, but hope itself. With tears now streaming freely down her face, she knelt in front of Michael. "I need to apologize to you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I treated you horribly. I judged you. I humiliated you, and I was completely, shamefully wrong." The confession was raw and sincere. Michael, with the generosity that only children possess, just smiled and touched her shoulder. "It's okay, Auntie. My dad says that making a mistake is like taking a part off. The important thing is knowing how to put it back on the right way. The boy's simple, profound forgiveness was what finally allowed Margaret's transformation to be complete. She wasn't just humbled, she was redeemed. Margaret stood up, no longer as the arrogant woman who had arrived, but as a protector with a new mission. She turned to Joe Roberts, her voice firm with a new purpose. "Your son is a treasure," she said, "and a talent of this magnitude cannot be limited by a lack of resources. I want to help. I will ensure that Michael has access to the best education money can buy, from the best schools to the best tutors. Whatever he needs to achieve his dreams, he will have it." It was not an offer of charity. It was an investment in a future that, thanks to a 10-year-old boy, she had finally come to believe could be brilliant again. Months later, the lives of Michael and his father were different. With Margaret's support, the boy flourished in one of the city's top schools, his brilliant mind finally receiving the stimulus it deserved. He continued to visit the workshop on weekends, but now as a junior consultant, whose opinions were heard with the deepest respect. Joe Roberts, in turn, was promoted to supervisor and also, with Margaret's help, began a specialization course in advanced mechanics. Father and son, once limited by their circumstances, were now learning and growing together, each proud of the other's journey. Tony's bet on a child's intuition had paid dividends of pure hope. The St. Joseph Auto Repair Shop, once a simple neighborhood business, became a legend in the city. The story of the boy genius spread, and owners of luxury cars now traveled from afar, not just for repairs, but for the chance to meet the extraordinary child who saw what no one else could. The place's reputation exploded, and the modest workshop became a symbol of excellence and, more importantly, of humility. The other mechanics, inspired by Michael's example, developed a new passion for learning, a new pride in their craft. The culture of the entire place was elevated, all because they learned to value the most unlikely voice. The greatest transformation, however, was Margaret's. One afternoon, while watching Michael sketch a new battery system on a napkin, she had an epiphany. She had spent her whole life measuring the worth of the world and of people in figures, in status, in appearances, and she had almost destroyed, because of that blindness, the most valuable thing she had ever encountered. Michael, with his childish wisdom and his generous heart, taught her what no business school could: that true wealth is not in what you possess, but in the potential you nurture in others. The relationship she built with that humble family became the most precious asset of her life, an investment with an incalculable return. The story that began with a scream of anger over a touch on a car ended with a conversation full of hope about the future. It was a journey that proved that prejudice is the rust of the soul, and that genius can flourish in the most unexpected places, as long as someone has the humility to water it. The lesson of that red Ferrari was not in its complex engine, but in a much simpler truth: that the world's greatest treasure might be hidden in plain sight, waiting only for a gaze humble enough to see beyond appearances, to see the soul behind the grease. A story that proves that talent has no age and humility is the greatest of wisdoms. If the journey of Michael and Margaret has inspired you, subscribe, like, and comment. Where you're watching from, let's celebrate together the hidden geniuses the world needs to discover.